This story contains adult language and themes, including but not limited to violence, murder, sexual assault, self-harm, and suicide. Discretion is advised. Welcome to hell. This is The Hidden Mountain, Episode 2. The air all over Brooklyn that morning was vibrating with sirens as Detective Esposito sat in her cruiser, drumming her fingers on the wheel while listening to reports come in from all over the city. Newsreaders were throwing around terms like Richter scale and numbers that she had always heard but never understood. Earthquakes weren't a common occurrence in New York City, and certainly not whatever 4.6 was meant to convey. There was damage to some of the older infrastructure, but on the whole, most of the people seemed little more than annoyed at what had happened when the earth trembled earlier that morning. Reports of low-level looting were coming in sporadically, and it seemed like the quake had shaken awake many of the lunatics in the 5 boroughs. Or people were simply losing their minds a little at being reminded of how small they were. It was going to be a long day, and here she was waiting on her partner. The wailing was mostly fire trucks and ambulances, although she couldn't see much smoke rising up around the boroughs. There was, however, one thick tower of black fumes stretching up from somewhere near Prospect Park that was hard to miss. It seemed to reach a gnarled finger accusingly up into a cloudless sky. At last, Detective Becky Horton emerged from her building looking like a mound of microwaved shit. Instead of bouncing on her toes in a way that had made Irene instantly dislike her the first time they'd met, Becky stumbled to the passenger door and flung herself in before lifting a large bottle of water to her cracked lips. "Jesus, Horton," Irene grimaced at her partner. "Maybe you should take a sick day or something." "Yeah, right," Becky scoffed in between sips of water, like they'd allow that. "Seriously, you look terrible." "Thanks," Becky grumbled. "I noticed. Let's just go. I'll be fine in a few minutes." Irene regarded her silently for a moment. "So, what are we on this morning? A house fire? Why?" "Well, it turns out it might be a homicide." Irene put the car in gear. "But we're off that. Some maintenance guy at Navy Yards thinks he found a dead body down by the river." What do you mean, thinks he found a dead body?" Becky asked. "Did they not call EMTs?" "Every medic in the 5 boroughs is busy, Horton," Irene replied. "We're on our own." Becky nodded and then leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, letting the streets roll by her unfocused eyes. Colors smeared out across her pupils as her headache breathed in and out, causing sharp hurt before ebbing away to a dull throb. It was a strange scene outside. Everywhere there were damaged buildings, and piles of bricks still lay on the sidewalk where they had fallen from old facades. Tree branches stretched across roads, pinning live electrical wires to the ground, threatening to electrocute anyone who went near them. It seemed like every emergency vehicle in the county was out on the streets that morning, including a few fire trucks that looked like they had just been rolled out of a museum. Amid all of this detritus, New Yorkers went about their day as they always seemed to do, stepping over whatever small fire or rubbish they needed to pass in order to get to their jobs. Subway service had been halted citywide until safety inspections could be completed, and the Brooklyn Bridge teemed with pedestrians all streaming over the river towards Manhattan. "Nothing stops this town, huh?" Irene remarked, eliciting a mere groan from her partner. Traffic was snarled that morning, of course, so by the time they arrived at the old Navy Yards, Becky was feeling better. Several guys crowded around one of their own who looked like someone had drained all the blood from his body. Becky inhaled deeply as they got out of the car, letting the cool October air purify her lungs. She could detect the faint smoky scent of burning wood on the breeze, and under normal circumstances would have been thinking about the coming fall. However, this morning, the smell brought nothing but dread. It couldn't mean anything good. "Hey, I'm George," the supervisor told them. "That's my guy, Julio, over there chain smoking." He pointed at the pale figure, who seemed to be inhaling cigarettes in a single draw before lighting up again. "He says he found a dead body down by the water." Up until this moment, they had both been hoping that it was a piece of plastic, or at most a mannequin, but the look on the terrified smoker's face gave them grave doubts. Normal people don't see dead bodies outside of funerals and are terrible guessers when they find a passed out vagrant or even a pile of garbage, but this guy had clearly seen something. George led them away from the parking lot and between the massive warehouses towards the water's edge, where they turned right and started walking along the narrow band of pebbles. The steel and glass skyline of the financial district watched them silently from across the river. Behind them, the blue iron of the Manhattan Bridge loomed ominously, and the hum of the city faded almost completely, leaving only the gentle sounds of lapping water. Further up the river, the Williamsburg Bridge connected the island to Brooklyn. That made at least 2 great places to jump into the East River, Irene noted, 3 if you count the Brooklyn Bridge. There, George pointed towards a small white figure lying face down beside some washed-up garbage. A familiar twist tightened Irene's stomach, and she knew immediately that this was no mannequin. She and Becky donned gloves as they edged down towards the body, carefully noting any footprints or evidence for later. "How close did your guy get to the body?" Becky asked, but George didn't know. There was a set of prints in the mud that looked to have been made by the kind of boots the men were wearing, but they stopped abruptly about 15 feet away and then turned back. Closer to the corpse, there was nothing. "You thinking jumper?" Becky asked. It would certainly explain why there were no footprints of any kind near the body. "Maybe," Irene answered, but there was something about this one that didn't give her suicide vibes. Maybe it was the small stature of the girl, for she could now see that it did appear to be a young girl, wearing a white dress lying face down on the pebbles, while her feet bobbed up and down on the wavelets in the brackish water. Carefully, Irene rolled the girl onto her back and gasped. She could not have been more than 14 years old, and her skin had the look of tea-stained porcelain, white and gray. Her blue lips were parted slightly, giving her the appearance of having died in the middle of saying something. Underneath her mess of wet hair, Irene could see some kind of symbol had been carved into her forehead, and her eyes were sewn shut with a thick red thread.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Hidden Mountain. Follow us for new episodes or visit findthehiddenmountain.com for more information.